As God is the author of history, he is able to use the events of history to symbolize deeper realities. We will see in literature examples where the author will include some detail, some particular way of arranging things in order to convey some allegorical meaning. Because in literature, the author is just making stuff up, and so he can make things happen so as to signify something. This is not something we standardly see in historical works. But God is the author of history. He can shape, through his providential care, how the events of history go, so that through them, he can signify some deeper reality. And this he particularly does with the events of history recorded in Scripture. And so, in today's gospel, he healed the leper in a particular way to signify a deeper reality. And this use of the events of Christ's life, both to record what Christ did in his actual life, but also through how these events played out to signify something deeper, is something that the fathers of the church often remark upon. And one particular thing that they will very frequently remark upon is how the details of some particular sin or some particular disease healed by Christ signify some particular truth about how Christ heals from sin. Now, obviously, this isn't because the people with visible sicknesses are any more sinful than the rest of us. No. Sickness comes through natural means that is regulated by the providential care of God, but doesn't really get associated with individual sin. Sin is a problem of our will. But both of these things are departures from God's design for man, and so the healing of a visible, physical disease can signify the healing inwardly from the spiritual disease of sin. And different kinds of diseases reflect different truths about how sin warps us. Most obviously, healings from deafness and blindness reflect Christ's healing from spiritual deafness and blindness. But other diseases require more care to see what their symbolic meaning is. And often that takes context that as 21st century American Christians isn't in the forefront of our mind. And so, sometimes, like today, the church will provide some helpful context. Because leprosy caused a lot of physical suffering. But leprosy, because it was a grave disease that was in some way contagious through contact, brought about the uncleanliness and hence isolation of the person suffering from it. Those who suffered from leprosy had to stay apart from the camp. They were not able to both associate with others but they were also, because they were unclean, excluded from the communal worship of God. And in this, we can see how sin separates us from others. Sin is something that we cannot share with others. For most of the areas of our life, we can speak about our cares and our joys quite openly with our family, with our friends, and even with comparative strangers. But because sin is something that is shameful, it is something that renders us unclean, some aspect of our life that if we give ourselves over to sin in that area, then all our thoughts in that area are not things that can be shared with others. And indeed, sin weakens our ability to worship God. Now, if this is full mortal sin that we habitually live in, then our ability to worship God is truly much diminished. We cannot fittingly receive communion. But in more standard cases, where it is merely some habit of venial sin, this doesn't prevent us from receiving communion worthily at all, but it does limit our ability to worship God. It does limit our ability to give the whole of our life, the whole of our cares, the whole of our efforts to Christ and follow Him throughout our day. But also, we can see, if we're attentive, how different Christ is from what came before. The old law had provisions for dealing with people who had leprosy or might have leprosy. And if they were healed from it, then they were to show themselves to the priest, and the priest would determine if this person had in fact been healed, if he was still sick, or whether it was still indeterminate. But the priests of the old law lacked the ability to heal the lepers. And indeed, physical contact with the lepers would render anyone unclean, both symbolically, but then also quite practically, because someone who had touched a leper might himself be infectious, and so he needed to be isolated. But with Christ, Christ heals the leper in a very particular way. Christ healed a variety of diseases through touch or application of water or spit or dirt, but quite frequently, Christ just healed with a word. But for the leper, he reached out his hand and touched him. Because Christ, instead of being made unclean by touching the leper, by touching the leper, he makes the leper clean. Instead of the infectious nature of leprosy, Christ brings infectious cleanliness. Christ brings infectious holiness. Christ brings infectious wholeness. And this ability to heal from the from sin, Christ hands on to the church. He gives the priests of the new law the ability not merely to certify that someone is clean, but to make clean from sin. And anyone who, like the leper, approaches Christ in the person of the priest in the confessional, truly penitent, kneels down and begs, saying, "If you wish, you can make me clean." If that sinner is truly penitent, Christ will surely say, "I do will it. Be made clean."